All right. So going from the international definition to the Canadian Income Tax Act. Section 248 of the Act contains definitions, including the definition of SR&ED. So scientific research or experimental development is, quote, a systematic investigation or search. It's got to be carried out in a field of science or technology. Very important. We'll talk about that. By means of experiment or analysis. So it could be either of those. Okay. It could be basic research, where you don't have a specific practical application. You don't see that too often in industrial R&D. Applied research, where you do. Or a term that Canada added called experimental development. So this is where we start to expand on these international definitions. Experimental development is any work that contemplates a technological advancement. So that's the key word. It contemplates, doesn't have to achieve it. It contemplates a technological advancement for the purpose of creating new or improving existing materials, devices, products, or processes, including incremental improvements thereto. Okay? So they're a little repetitive in the legislation, but they're saying developing a new product or process could be an advancement, or improving an existing product or process, as long as, and the critical point is, it contemplates technological advancement. So technological advancement is the paramount definition that we're looking for. The Act then goes on, and this is in the Act right now. A lot of people are talking about moving this out of the Act, but for now it is, that there's 8 types of supporting activities. And we'll talk about the last one, which is a bit of a tricky one. That as long as these activities are necessary to resolve a pre-stated problem or technological uncertainty, and we'll talk about what that is, all of the work, to the extent it's done in that country, in our case Canada, by a taxable supplier, which would be a Canadian employee or a Canadian subcontractor who ideally invoices you with a business or HST number. Okay? So as long as we have work done by a taxable supplier and it's one of these 8 types of activities, we're in. The first 4 are the ones that are typically obvious to people. If I say, what did you do for your research and development? Without any training, just the definition that they'd inherently think of as research and development. So they think, well, all the engineering that the engineer does and the design and operations research and maybe the mathematical analysis of different formulas. Most people think, yeah, that's the R&D, and they would be correct. As we go down this list, it gets a little more complicated. Any computer programming that we do that's necessary to resolve a pre-stated uncertainty would be in, and that's the link. There doesn't have to be uncertainty on how to write the code. We may say, well, you know what, we've developed this new machine and added a new axis here, and we have to write the PLC or the logic controllers to tell the machine how to move. So we hire these guys who program that, and they're very expensive because they're very skilled. But they'll probably do whatever you want. If I say, I want this machine to go here, grip it, and move on this axis, and drop it here, no problem. They'll make it do exactly what I want to do. There's no uncertainty in that. However, if I said, well, I need it to see if there's collisions or other issues, if that motion profile is optimal, and I cannot test it without having that computer code, then that's in. So you have to make that causal link between, was this work necessary to answer a pre-stated problem or uncertainty? We'll talk about how to build that structure. The next 2 are what really open the field up. The Act says that any data gathering that's necessary to resolve a pre-stated uncertainty is in. So once I've defined my problem, any data that I go and gather to answer that question, the time and cost to do that would be in. If, in fact, I've already collected data, maybe over the last 5 years of production, we've collected a lot of manufacturing data, and maybe I can use some of that to answer my problem. If that's the case, that work is not in, because we've already collected that data before I define the problem. Okay? So the problem definition, or what the government would call the uncertainty, the technological uncertainty, is paramount in determining what type of activities are in. And the key thing is always to link it. I needed to do this to answer or resolve this uncertainty. Okay? If you can make that link, then it's really easy. Probably the most contested issue is testing. This is the one that blows it all open. So anything that's testing that I need to do to test whether something works is in. Okay? And testing is a very broad term. What does testing mean? Does that mean mine testing? Does that mean I use my customers to test? What's testing? Well, when you go to court and you interpret the law, what the judge is going to say is, and they taught this in the in-depth tax course that I took back in the 90s, is that you read the law in plain English with no hidden meaning, as a reasonable person would interpret it. You don't have to be a lawyer. What do you think testing means? And so you see if a judge interprets it, they'll go to a dictionary. What is Webster's definition of testing? Are we doing testing or are we not doing testing? And as long as you followed the Act, you're going to be in. So the Act is paramount. We're going to talk about the Act first, and then we might talk about Canada Revenue Agency interpretations or bulletins or things like that, but they're really secondary to the Act. Ultimately, this is the source. If push comes to shove, a judge is not going to look at any Canada Revenue Agency papers at all. They're only going to be constrained by the Act. And they have to do it that way. The rationale behind that is that the law itself was passed by our elected officials, people that you and I voted for, that have the right to draft legislation, get royal assent, and if it passes royal assent, it becomes law. It goes through the House of Commons, Senate, and a series of processes. And then it gets handed to the Canada Revenue Agency, who's very much like a police officer, who then enforces those laws passed by our elected officials. The Canada Revenue Agency has no ability to create laws. Okay? They must follow the laws that our elected officials pass. So we'll talk about situations where often the Canada Revenue Agency's interpretations may not jive or be completely in line with the law itself. And that's where we like to look at the tax cases and what are the implications of that. Okay? Psychological research is probably another very complicated one that's listed in the Income Tax Act, but we're going to talk about that a little later. Because one of the exclusions from SR&ED is something called research in the social sciences. And then we'll look in psychological research as a social science. So they put it in, and then they kind of pull it back out again, which creates a bit of a area of confusion. What really happens with psychological research, according to the Canada Revenue Agency, is it's really restricted to maybe one field, and that would typically be pharmaceuticals, where at a final stage of testing, they've gone through mice, then rats, then cats, and usually 10 to 20-year process, and finally they test it on human beings. And in addition to all the chemical and biological tests, they'll do psychological tests as well, and the government believes that that's tied directly to the bioscience, so that would all be a supporting activity. Okay? In other fields like software, you don't want to claim advancements in psychological research because then they'll say, well, that's more social science. Okay? So again, a lot of confusion on the terms themselves versus how they actually settle out when you're doing a claim. Now, currently the Act goes on to list a whole bunch of things that are not SR&ED. And for the last 7 or 8 years, people have been talking, finance has been talking about maybe removing these from the Act. Because they said they're not really necessary in the Act. They're things that are, if you understand the first part about what's in, these are examples of things that would not fit those things. So again, do we need examples in the Act? Right now they're in there. So they talk about commercial production, market research or sales promotion. Commercial production is something that happens on every successful SR&ED project to the extent it becomes commercially viable and you take it to market. So there will be a point of experimental production where we're still trying to use the production to resolve pre-stated technological uncertainties or problems, or commercial production where we're now producing it and we appear to have resolved all of our stated problems. And it's up to the claimant to define for the Canada Revenue Agency where that point happened. Where do they think as developers they've switched from the uncertainty phase into the certainty phase? Okay? And that's the shift from experimental production to commercial production. So, market research or sales promotion, just like they sound. Quality control or routine testing. So if we take every 1,000th widget off the line and test it to make sure our machines are calibrated and things along that nature, that in itself is not experimental development or scientific research. However, if we change something or create an uncertainty and then have to take a certain number of samples off to test and understand or resolve our uncertainty, that work would be in. Okay? So there's routine testing and then there's experimental testing. And again, the difference is technological uncertainty. We'll talk about research in the social sciences or humanities, but these would include things like economics, marketing, business studies. So anything that seems intuitive or psychological, psychology in general, those things would all get caught. They're not eligible for tax credits. I may have a very complicated 80-page economic model with lots of formulas, but the field of economics is not an eligible science, so that probably would not qualify. Okay? Any changes that you cannot measure, run the risk of being deemed a style change. The tax courts have repeated a line since the 1980s when SR&ED credits first started coming to court. And they say that systematic investigation, which is one of the components of a project, involves extremely accurate measurement and subsequent analysis of those measurements. They go on to say that without such measurement and analysis, systematic investigation cannot exist. Okay? So what does that mean for me on a R&D project perspective? Well, it means I want to provide as many quantifiables as possible. If I'm developing a paint, I like to use that example, and I say, well, this color of green looks better or cleaner. Those are layman terms. They don't involve measurements. So better or cleaner would generally not cut it. That would not be seen as systematic investigation. If instead we said, well, we want to develop this new coating or resin, and we want to do a test down in Florida where we put it in the sun and we bake it for 5 years, and we want the chromography to be a certain level at this angle, and this angle, well, now we're starting to get into extremely accurate measurements, which would be indicative of experimental development or scientific research. Provide as many, rule of thumb here, provide as many measurables on the objectives as possible. Because what tends to happen is there's often no single objective that creates the problem. It's a stack up of objectives. We want to create this resin that lasts for this long at this price point, which maybe means we can't use more expensive chemicals or things like that. So when we add all of the objectives together, they start to stack up to create the technological uncertainty. That we know if we had $100 a unit, it would be no problem, but now we want to do it for $70 a unit. This could create a lot of technological problems. Okay? Very important, claims filed after, for a corporation, 18 months. So there's a filing due date. The filing due date for a corporation is 6 months after your year end. And the Act gives you 12 months from the filing due date. So effectively, if I have a company with a December 2014 year end, December 31, I've got till June 30th, 2016 to file or amend my claim for R&D credits. My tax return would normally be due by June 30th, 2015, and that's where they would prefer for you to file, and we'll talk about why that's a great strategy to file a complete claim on time with your tax return within 6 months of year end. But nevertheless, the Act gives you the right to file or amend claims up to 18 months from year end, and we'll talk about some of the strategies related to that as we go through. Okay, just a comparison. So we've talked about the Canadian rules. The IRS rules are very similar. So instead of the 3 points that we talk about here, what they call the advancement uncertainty and systematic investigation in Canada, in the US they talk about a permitted purpose, discovering information. Again, if you read the interpretation, it's very much like our advancement. They talk about elimination of uncertainty, which is exactly our definition of uncertainty. And they talk about a process of experimentation, which if you read the interpretation is more or less our systematic investigation definition. So again, the same definitions tend to apply in each of these fields. The fields that are eligible are, again, all based on OECD definitions. These are not Canadian definitions. These are international definitions that they use to classify different industries. So the 4 eligible ones are your natural, engineering, medical, health, and agricultural sciences. Anything related to those fields is generally an eligible field of science. The ones that are excluded are social sciences and humanities. So things like marketing, accounting, economics, psychology, other than psychology for biotech. There's a series of Canada Revenue Agency guides, some of which we're going to refer to throughout the course. There used to be a whole series of interpretation bulletins, information circulars, and application policies, but in December 2012, the government repealed all of them, claiming that there was conflicting information or ideas or concepts, and they've tried to streamline them with 10 new smaller projects. We might talk about 1 or 2 today, along with several new guidelines, which are fairly similar, and according to the government, don't represent any change in policies. Okay? They've also released manuals, different versions of manuals. There's a shortened version and a detailed version of what they call the audit manuals or review manuals. There's one for the technology side, the research and technology advisors, and there's one for the financial reviewers. So they'll talk about step-by-step the process that each of these reviewers should do with their client as they go out to perform the review process. Okay, any questions about the Act so far? So having said that we've got an international definition of R&D or SR&ED in Canada, and we've got these three components, sorry, that we just have to show technological advancement and experimental development. The next question is, okay, well, how do I write this on a piece of paper or in my tax return so that you believe I've done experimental development? How do I myself define what that is? So the Canada Revenue Agency says, well, the way that we want you to submit the information to us to determine if you're doing SR&ED is at the project level. And this is very important. They say that every company, whether they know it or not, who does R&D or SR&ED, follows something called an activity, project, program hierarchy. So you may have an R&D program of cost reduction. We're going to reduce the cost of every product that we have until we get to zero. And that's probably never going to happen, not in the last 1,000 years, but we're going to keep trying because that'll make us more competitive. So the CRA said, well, that's fantastic that you've got a cost reduction program, but we can't evaluate your projects on that basis. We need to see what your cost reduction project is within that program. So, well, what do you mean by that? Well, so that's easy. Let's say I'm Goodyear and I manufacture radial tires. And I make this tire, top performing tire, for $100 US a unit. And I have a hypothesis that in the next 2 years, I can do some research and bring that down to $95 a unit. Do some process changes, and I don't know, I'm going to change some stuff that involves technological uncertainty. Okay? So a project generally has a scope of 3 years or less. Where am I now? Where do I expect to be in 3 years or less? Projects can go on more than 3 years, but if so, you usually want to be very specific about why is that project going on more than 3 years. If you've got reasons, that's fine. So they say, okay, we'll define the project as right now I'm at $100 a unit and I want to get to $95 a unit within the next 2 years, and I hope that I can do it. Okay? So that's fine. Now we can talk about what are our technological advancements, which means a technological advance includes resolution of technological uncertainty and systematic investigation. Okay? Without those two things, it's arguable there is no technological advance when we look at the definition. So I'm going to use three shapes, square, triangle, and circle, to represent the three concepts of what we want. And there's a lot of debate about what's the optimal way to disclose something like this. How do I show that I'm achieving a technological advance? And the first is, we want to talk about what's standard practice. And what the government says is you want to take advantage of all readily available information that's available to someone skilled in the art. So what does that mean? Well, someone skilled in the art, according to the government, would usually have a Bachelor of Science or equivalent training, formal training, or perhaps a college diploma in that field of technology. Without the formal education, you still may be eligible to do SR&ED. However, they're going to scrutinize your background a little closer. Okay? In software, it's very common. I see people who are self-taught, or their field of science is totally different. They have a chemical engineering degree, but then they switched to software 15 years ago. I mean, these things happen, and they taught themselves. So that can be fine. But again, what they're going to do if they don't see formal education or background in that field of science is they're going to look at your actual research and how you benchmark the standard practice to determine, is this person qualified to do that research, or are they just learning themselves to get up to the level where they'd be qualified? Because training is not an eligible research expense. Okay? So our first question is, how do we show that we're thinking outside the box? That we've taken advantage of readily available information available to someone skilled in the art? Well, I'd say it's obvious. You tell them what you did. You call it due diligence procedure or whatever you do, and most companies do this. The funny thing is, I found, it doesn't really matter the industry, this happens a lot, but people aren't very good at the record keeping. When they're looking at hundreds of articles or they're brainstorming, they'll make some notes, but they usually don't keep those articles or flag it. And then when I come back 2 years later and I say, can you shoot me 5 or 6 of the articles, of those 100 articles you looked at. Then they have to go back and find them, and they can't find it on Google anymore. It gets to be a bit of a mess. So what we say is, look, here's all the different things you could do, and let's try to do this up front. The earlier that we can define the problems, that we can show, here's our objectives, here's some methods that would be available typically to solve a problem like that, and here's why those methods don't apply here. Okay? So what would we do to show what methods are there? And we said, well, the standard one is internet, Google search. Google would be your search engine, or Yahoo, or whatever you're using, but some kind of internet search is usually the starting point. So we do an internet search, we find X number of articles. We're going to talk about refining that with what we call a prior art or patent search, which is a little more detailed on the technology side. And this isn't really us doing it. Google came out with a whole bunch of tools recently that they've called prior art search tools. And they really lead directly into what we're doing and make the process that much more efficient. So we'll talk about how that can work. Okay? So what possible sources we have? Did we look at competitors? Did we look at proprietary things that we've done in-house that we might be leveraging? That's a great thing to mention, because if we've developed something that's our own proprietary knowledge, we usually don't have anyone else we can go to. We developed it. We created these problems, so now we have to solve it with our own solutions. These are all indicators of us taking reasonable steps to benchmark standard practice or readily available information. Potential component suppliers can often give us direction on how to use their components or ingredients or whatever, and they may be experts. Or just what we call general experts in the field, whether it's free information someone gives you on a blog, or you pay someone $1 million to do an in-depth study for you, or anything in between. That could all be eligible. So we like to start with, how do we determine the boundary of existing knowledge? What's inside the box, and are we thinking outside the box? The courts have just said that the claimant is supposed to do reasonable amount of work, okay, on the due diligence. Can they define what reasonable is? This is where the discrepancies come. How much is reasonable? Well, I'd say, well, that depends on a lot of factors, really. Factor one, I'd say, is how much are we spending? I would assume on a $10 million project, it would be reasonable to do a little more due diligence than a $10,000 project. But again, that's just an assumption. The reality is the $10 million project might be so advanced that there's only 3 or 4 people in the world who know about it, and the specialist who's doing it knows everything about them, so they can very quickly benchmark what's known. Again, each situation will have its own, like a snowflake, will have its own specific attributes, and we have to be cognizant of that, right? My rule of thumb is do as much due diligence as you can. It's never going to hurt you. The more the better. There is no right answer about how much is enough. More is better, and it will be up to the judge to determine whether they think it's reasonable or not. And we'll look at some case examples as we go through. That the judges are actually pretty amenable to, pretty reasonable in accepting a reasonably small amount of due diligence as adequate. Okay? So the next thing is, how do we get those quantifiable objectives? How do we show that our objectives are quantifiable so that that drives the extremely accurate measurements and analysis of those measurements that we're going to need to show that we've got systematic investigation? Again, what I like to do here is benchmark each of our objectives. Here's our current performance, and here's where we want to go to. So in my example, we're at $100 a unit of cost, and we want to get to $95 a unit. Or maybe we can withstand 100 psi of pressure, and we want to go to 110 psi. Some kind of measurables. I don't really care what it is, and as many relevant ones as possible. So think, what are the objectives that are relevant when we stack them up are going to create the problems to achieve all of these objectives together. And by providing all of those, that gives us the scope to illustrate the experimental process. All right. Oh, you're welcome to ask questions. We've added some extra time in here on that. So even though we started late, we're good. OK, so let's assume at this point we have a project, we've gone and done our due diligence, and we say, you know what, we've got some really good ideas we saw of how people have developed similar things, but nothing's exactly like we're doing, or not in the same environment, or there's some differences here where we cannot just pick an existing method, plug it in, and have it work. We're going to have to do some changes. So this is really what we call technological uncertainty. We're uncertain of the optimal path, route, equipment configuration, system architecture, circuit technique, and so forth to either achieve the desired results or to optimize the integration. Okay? So how do we show technological uncertainty? And this is something where the process I'm proposing here is not necessarily what the CRA, they don't really talk about this at all. The tax courts talk about this a lot. So I'm going to talk about, here's what the tax courts said they would like to see as evidence. And we'll look at evidence of the tax courts providing this evidence when they're reviewing a claim for eligibility. Okay? And typically what happens is, in any field of science, you have a model. You have a formula or an algorithm that says, you know, if I'm going to mix this formula, I put in X units of this and Y units of that and W units of this in some sequence. Okay? And all of those are variables. A variable is something that I, as a developer, could change. I could choose to add this step in step 7 or step 3. So I've made a choice there. That's a variable, something under my control that I could change in order to try to achieve the objectives. Now, this is the real art of optimizing this process. We found that the claims that do the best and are easiest to pull together get the team of developers. Well, the easiest claims are the ones where there's only one developer, so that simplifies it. That simplifies the process right there. Let's assume that we're in a larger company where maybe there's a 10 or 15 person development team. This is where it really gets to be fun, to try to get everyone to agree. What are our objectives? This sounds funny. You think, well, we all agree on the objectives. We have weekly meetings. Usually you can agree on the objectives. That part is pretty good. The due diligence, usually people do their own due diligence. Maybe they discuss at a meeting, so they'll piece that together. But what are the variables of uncertainty? And this is where if you can get the discussion going on that with the group as early as possible, everything falls into place. So the problem here is that a crack team may identify, on a very complicated model, 30 to 50 variables of uncertainty. I've seen doctors who have medical programs that model 200 variables or characteristics about patients. You know? And a lot of them say, well, I think these 50 are the most important. So I'm going to focus on those, and then I'm going to try to rank them. You know? Is someone's age more important than their bone density or whatever? Some variables that they're looking at, and try to improve those models. So I think by changing these variables, I can improve the predictive accuracy or the performance of this model. That's a technological advance. Usually the standard practice is what existing model is there, what are the weaknesses? And the weaknesses are always the same. We're either missing some variables, or the variables that we have are not, the model that we have is not representative of what's actually happening in reality. And we've got to tweak that model to make it more predictive or more functional. All right? So the trick here is to get the team to agree as early as possible on what are the top 3 to 5 variables. This sounds pretty easy, but this is really the art of optimizing an SR&D process. Once we've defined what are the variables of uncertainty that are not predictable from existing models or knowledge or standard practice, whatever due diligence that we've done, according to the Canada Revenue Agency, and I would say the law in general, this is where the SR&ED portion of the project starts. Okay? Everything that you've done, all your due diligence, all the way to the point that you can phrase the first problem or the first uncertainty, and I evidence that by saying, I have this model, you know, I have my SolidWorks model that will tell me, you know, maybe how to do a mold and what materials to use, but it's wrong here because I've got a material that someone just invented. It never existed before, so SolidWorks doesn't understand how it works. It's similar to another nylon here, but it's different, and I'm going to have to figure out how to model it. That would be a classic technological advancement. There's no method on how to do it, no predictive algorithms. There's predictive algorithms that are close, but I'm going to have to tweak those algorithms or improve them in order to work. Beautiful. From the point that we can define, I like to say, 3 or more variables of uncertainty, that a change in one will change the other. So if I change variable X, it could have an unpredictable effect on Y or Z. Then we have what's called a system uncertainty. And those are really the kinds of uncertainty that we want to rank highest. So if I make a change here, it could have an unpredictable upstream or downstream effect on any of the other variables. Perfect. Okay? Now I say I like to see 3 or more variables. Okay? If you only have one variable, if I say, well, I'm doing heat treating here, and my variable is how long do I heat it for? And that's the only thing I'm testing. That's probably not going to fly as experimental development. This is where if it's a single variable, the government will quite rightly come in and say, well, that's routine engineering, or what we call fine-tuning. It's like tuning a radio. If I say, well, go to station 103.8, you may overshoot to 103.9 and go back to 103.7, but I say, hey, we've got all day. We'll just sit here until you get it. You're going to get it. You're going to be able to tune in eventually. There's no uncertainty whatsoever. A skilled person will be able to do that every time without fail. If I say, well, you know what? Variable 1 depends on variable 2. I got temperature and pressure. So what's the optimal temperature? Well, you got to tell me what pressure you're using, because if you change the pressure, my optimal temperature may change. Okay? And the reality is, say in plastics, I may have temperature, I may have pressure, and I may have amount of glass fiber content in the material. If I change any one of those, the other two factors may change unpredictably. That's system uncertainty. 3 or more factors are what I like to see to say there's an eligible project. 5 or more factors will be a very strong project. Okay? So I like to outline minimum 3, ideally 5. As I've said, there's some scientists that I deal with who have 40 or 50 factors. As each factor gets added, the problem becomes geometrically more complex, right? So if I do 10 tests for temperature and 10 tests for pressure, it might sound like I have 20 tests, right? But in reality, I have 100 tests. If I had 10 tests for glass fiber, now I got 1,000 tests. And you can see that every variable I add, the problem becomes geometrically more problematic. When you have 40 or 50 factors, you need supercomputers to calculate this, and it takes them years. Like, you literally are making estimates. So 5 or more factors is a very strong project. As far as 40 factors is unbelievably strong. That's almost unquestionably strong project. Okay. Now, let's assume that we've documented the first 2 parts. We've got the technological uncertainty, and now all we need to do is document what we did, our results and conclusions. And this is actually the lion's share of the work, but this should be relatively easy. I found in situations or companies where we meet one time and everyone agrees that, you know, temperature, pressure, and glass fiber content are the variables, so whenever they're out doing stuff, they're going to look for any changes or observations they can make about any of those variables. All of that time and work would be in. So anytime anyone in the company does any activity within the country, so if we're talking Canada, a Canadian employee or a Canadian contractor who does the work in Canada, we'll talk about that later, and they say, I needed to do this work to answer that uncertainty, or understand any of those variables of uncertainty, that work should be in. Anything that you needed to do to get the project done for the customer, but you did not need to do to answer the uncertainty. Okay, when the machine was done, we painted it blue because that's the color the client wanted. That's part of the business project, but unless that coloring was necessary to resolve an uncertainty, that would not be in. Okay? So the government wants to say, how have you defined the cost of your business project, and then which of those costs are the SR&ED costs, the subset of that business project. And what they want you to do is say, the only activities I've claimed are the ones where I thought I needed to perform this activity in order to understand one or more of those variables better. Okay? If I can make that link, it's in. If I can't, it's out. So it becomes very objective if you have the right information. The problem in going to courts is very often the claimant does not have all of that information. They're missing 1 or 2 key components, and the judges may still grant them the credits. However, we don't want to create those problems. We're going to talk about how forgiving the courts are, but again, how to build the perfect description so we don't have to go that route in the first place. Okay? So really, like I said, the lion's share of the documentation is what did I actually do now that we defined the problems. But that part is relatively easy if the people doing the work are given the right direction and given a method to tell us what they did. Right? So try to integrate them, get them involved. Don't wait a year and a half and go back and interview them 2 years after the work was done or a year after the work. Try to get this going live, and you're going to have an easy time of it. So the first thing that we want to do now on this side is say, how do I get a desk review? Okay? And what happens is when you file an SR&ED tax credit claim, every single claim, according to CRA, is reviewed. Somebody actually reads it. 85% of claims are assessed as filed. Okay? So they read it, they say, this is good, give this person their money, and assess as filed. 15% then go into what they call reviews. It could be a technical review, or it could be a financial review, or it could be both. It really depends. They have risk factors on determining what they're going to do. And then they're going to come out and visit you. I've seen a project for over $1 million written on, probably less than one paragraph. And it said, we did 43 different prototypes in 7 different classes, and here was what was different about each class, and here's what we learned. And I remember the reviewer was like an engineer, PhD kind of guy, and he said, oh, you know what, I used to work in industry, I had all these problems with thermal deformations and whatever, how'd you do it? Oh, here we did, we built forms. He said, looked at it, and he said, oh, each of those is probably 500 to 600 man hours, times 43 prototypes, $1 million, assess this file. Now, that was during a site review, but the reality is we want someone to be able to do that. We want the Canada Revenue Agency reviewer, scientist, to be able to do that from his or her desk. So what I found is be as explicit as possible. Assume that the person reading that has a background in your industry, because they often do. They've done 5, 10, 15, maybe 20 years, and they've done everything that you're talking about. They know what's a reasonable time to do this test. Is it an hour, 10 hours? Is it 100 hours? And they're looking for gross plausibility. So they're not going to come back like your boss. Hey, Dave, you spent 100 hours. I could have done this in 85. They're not going to be definitive like that. They'll say, you spent 100 hours. I could have done this in 1. Can you show me evidence of what you did so I can understand why it took you 100 hours? So anything that doesn't look plausible to them or looks out of the ordinary, that's where they'll start asking for evidence of experimentation. So we work backwards and we say, well, what evidence does someone need? Because they've never visited us, they don't know us, they don't really know what we're about. Maybe they looked at our website and they're trying to review whether the $3 million we're claiming is in or not. And what we found is, we asked ourselves, what does that person need in order to make an informed decision? So as we said, they need to know how many different. If I said I did many, a lot of people do this, we did many prototypes. Okay? So we'll take the rationale that the reviewer is using, saying, okay, 500 at man hours per prototype times many. How much is that? I'll tell you, the answer is site visit. That's the answer to that. You're not going to get that money. People think, oh, I'll fool the reviewers. I'll use terms like many, or various, or lots of, or several. The courts have said that scientists don't talk like that. Scientists use extremely accurate measurements and then provide subsequent analysis of those measurements. So again, without such measurement and analysis, systematic investigation cannot exist, is what they're going to say over and over. So again, try to quantify as many. The next thing is, okay, how many did I look at and how did I do the work? Was it just analysis? Analysis can be very quick. Supercomputers or computers, I might be able to analyze 200 alternatives in 5 minutes with the right modeling software, or a day, let's say. It usually doesn't take that long to analyze stuff. But let's say I analyzed 200 different configurations, and then I went out onto the shop floor to try 3 or 4 that looked like maybe they're the most plausible, and we'll experiment with those. So now I'm out on the shop floor ripping machinery apart, putting it back together, testing it. It's probably not an hour per alternative. It may be hundreds of man hours, right? And let's say we eventually decide, you know what, we can't tweak the existing line like we thought. Our hypothesis was wrong, but it led us to a new hypothesis that we'll just redesign this whole assembly line from scratch. We'll scrap this one, we'll redo a whole brand new one. We'll build a whole new prototype. Now we're probably talking about thousands and thousands of man hours. Again, so it always depends on the industry and assuming that someone's familiar, but we find at this level of detail, how many, and then which of these 3 main categories are we talking about, so that the reviewer can go in, what kind of prototype are they looking at, see the product on your website perhaps or something in there, and say, yes, I believe that's a reasonable amount of time, or I think I need to go do a site visit to determine where these guys really spent the money, because there's a problem here. Okay? So how many and what method is the first thing. That's going to help us justify our cost. The next step is, for each of the objectives that we stated, what was our result? Did we meet our result? We got from $100 to $95 cost reduction that we're looking at. Did we exceed our result? We got from $100 to $88. We exceeded our expectations. Or did we fail? We didn't get anywhere. Actually, our process was worse. We're up to $102. Each case, that's just a result. It is what it is. The more important thing is, and this is again a problem, that a lot of people stop here, that they've got a good project, they stop here, oh, client's happy, we sold lots of units, end of story. At this point, we've just got a business advancement. The technological advancement is the conclusion. That's my interpretation of it. The technological advancement at the end of the day is the conclusion, but only if all of the other components are there. only if you've properly defined standard practice, only if you define technological uncertainties beyond that, and only if you've systematically done the work to resolve those uncertainties. So the conclusion represents the advancement. Courts and governments say that the product doesn't have to be successful at all. Learning why something failed often represents a technological advancement. So it's generally often your failures are better evidence of the advancement as long as you're understanding why. And the conclusion is the why. Why do I think this happened? What did I, because there's kind of a general assumption that a company's not going to spend money to do something that it knows is going to fail. Okay? It's either going to, well, usually not. It's either going to think it's going to work, or maybe it knows it's going to fail, but it does it because it wants to understand why. And again, that's kind of where you're going in with those things. So often working back from what things failed. The why would I not do this again question is really what we want people to be asking themselves all the time. Not only what happened, how do I explain that? How could I have exceeded my expectation? How could I be at 200% of expectation? I tried to get to 95 and I'm at 88. I'm at more than 200%. Maybe I didn't understand the implications of these variables together, that these things were so synergistic. Fantastic, that's a great advance. Or they were not synergistic. Okay, that's an advance too. Now we know something we didn't know before and that was arguably beyond standard practice from a skilled person. Okay? The last part is, what technological documentation did we keep? So keep any evidence of experiment or analysis. The government doesn't tell you how to do experiment or analysis. They'll use whatever records you have. I've seen them take stuff written on back of napkins. I've seen them accept things written in different languages. As long as the person could explain, well, here's the shapes of what we're doing. They said at the time frame that said it happened. They're fine with all of that. They're going to work with you however you document your research, but you have to keep some level of documentation. You can't say I did all the experiments and it's all up in my head and there's no record of results of my tests. Okay? So that's, again, an important part. Difference between what they call systematic and random investigation, where someone works on a machine, maybe does 8 or 10 prototypes, and then throws all the evidence out because they got the right one. That's going to be very hard to claim SR&ED on that, even though it probably happened. Okay. Okay, so putting it all together. To have a technological advancement, first step is we got to be thinking outside the box, meaning we have to define standard practice, then we have to identify uncertainties, and I would say variables of uncertainty that would not be readily predictable or available to someone skilled in the art. Once we have the technological uncertainty, or the variables of uncertainty is a great way to communicate it to the team, anything that any of the team does, any investigative activities, would be in. All right? So here's a one-page framework of what we're trying to do. So benchmark existing knowledge. Try to provide top 3 to 5 measurable objectives, or more if you have them, any relevant objectives. Then top 3 to 5 variables of experimentation. Yes?
Is the variables of experimentation for each objective? Is that what you're saying, 3 to 5 for each objective?
No.
3 to 5 for the whole project?
For the whole project. Right. Question. So what will happen is often the objectives stack up to create the variables of uncertainty. Okay, I have to create this plastic part for under $100 a unit, and it's currently 110. Maybe I can use a different material. Maybe I can do some additives. Maybe I can change my process. That would be all the variables that I'm going to do in order to achieve that combination of objectives. You know, I want it to be $100 a unit, but I want it to have the same PSI standard and ratings and whatever. I don't want any quality decrease. So I'd list all those while maintaining my cost. Okay? So the cost reduction wouldn't be a problem alone, but if I have to maintain all my performance criteria and reduce, well, now this could be a problem. I can't just provide a cheaper substitute. Okay. So moving right along, various roles. What happened is the Canada Revenue Agency, when they issued these consolidated documents in December 2012, did one that compared what they're asking for on the technology side with what the tax courts are asking for, or the method that the tax courts are using in order to analyze projects when they're coming to court. So the CRA had its 3 criteria, and the tax court instead are asking 5 different questions. And we're saying, well, how does the tax court's criteria jive or correlate with the CRA's criteria? So we're going to talk about this. And really what I'm going to do is I'm going to work backwards from our criteria, what we're recommending, and show you how it's a little more detailed than what the CRA recommends, but it meets all of the CRA criteria and it meets all of the tax court criteria. Right? So again, step 1A, benchmark standard practice, quantify objectives, correlate experiments to a hypothesis. It's the term CRA uses. I'll call that variables. Ensure work's done systematically and really clarify the conclusions. Systematically means some record of it was done that correlates back to the variables and the uncertainties, and you've made a conclusion at the end of the day. If that happens, we're fine. Okay? So as we mentioned, that the CRA in 2012 replaced all of its previous papers with several new papers. And probably the most significant thing is them doing this analysis where they're correlating their criteria with the tax court's criteria. Okay, so we talked about the CRA criteria already. My biggest problem is they use the word technological advancement at the start of a project. Okay? And at least they have it right now. They say, what technological advancement did you contemplate at the start of the project? They used to say, what technological advancement was achieved? And I'm saying, well, if you look at the scientific method, which everyone understands, it goes objective, hypothesis, analysis, results, conclusions. And the beautiful thing about the scientific method is, in my experience, it's universal. I can talk to people from Asia, Russia, Africa, South America, and I say everyone knows exactly what I'm talking about. There's no need to explain scientific method. Scientific method is universally understood, and it's really what the tax courts are looking at. Right? Unfortunately, as I said, what the courts call an advancement is the conclusion at the end of the day. So if you ask for the conclusion up front, it really confuses people that think logically in the scientific method. You're flipping it all upside down. Okay? So the technological advancement contemplated, which requires the uncertainty through systematic investigation. And again, as long as you show this, CRA doesn't care which boxes you put it in. You just have to show the criteria. So we talked about the ACT definition, systematic investigation, field of science or technology, basic applied research or experimental development. We'll reiterate that again. And then the 5-step process of the tax court. So they ask 5 questions, and the second question when you go to tax court breaks everything out. So they say, is there technical risk or uncertainty? Technical risk is the term used by the tax court. CRA says it's not technical risk isn't a matter at all, it's technological risk. Technological is the method to get there. Technical just means dealing with technology. Technological means the method to come to an answer. Okay? Just more semantics. Did the person doing the shred form a hypothesis aimed at reducing or eliminating the uncertainty? Okay? And then they talk about observation of subject matter, creating objectives, tying it to uncertainties, forming hypotheses, and then doing systematic testing. Again, our scientific method. They even close it off. The courts say, did the procedures follow the scientific method? Okay? The government of Canada, CRA, doesn't use those terms, but the tax courts do. The tax courts have recognized that scientific method is what we're looking at here. And it's great that they do because, like I say, I don't have to teach that to anyone. Every scientist I've ever talked to, in every language and every culture, knows exactly what the scientific method is. So following that is a very simple thing to do. Okay? Did it result in a technological advance of the general understanding? So again, if you have a model and you're improving the model, that's a representation of your general understanding of how and why something works. Okay? And did you keep detailed records of hypothesis tests and results? So that's, again, to be systematic, you have to keep records of the results of measurements. You can't do everything in your head. You want to keep some kind of notes. Okay? They don't tell you how, but keep some kind of records. Okay? There's a really good case called RIS Christie and some other cases where the judge talks about what's the role of the Canada Revenue Agency Research and Technology Review, or them as an expert witness when they come to court. And what the judges have said repeatedly is the decision of whether something is SR&ED when you go to court is strictly up to the court as a matter of law. It's not up to the CRA, and the CRA's opinion on something does not matter at all other than how it's backed up with facts and evidence. Okay? So the CRA scientists or reviewer saying, I don't think it's a technological advancement, is completely worthless unless they have evidence of where similar technology was used and where that would have been appropriate. Okay? And the ones where they're successful, they've done exactly that. Here's some methods that were available that the client didn't contemplate, and the client didn't refute that. Didn't say, well, here's why these methods wouldn't apply. Okay? So they say that the role of the expert is to assist the judge in acting like a set of prescription glasses through which the technical information can be reviewed. An example would be on the technological uncertainty. We're developing this new tire. The judge may not have a background in chemical engineering, probably not, or whatever field of science. They can't be, they've got a background generally in law. But they would ask two experts, why do you think this was an uncertainty? Why do you think this wasn't a technological uncertainty? And they'll expect those experts, who should be experts in the field, to tell them, well, I looked at 100 articles and I found some ideas, but I couldn't find the solution because of these variables. Or I found a solution here which provides the answer. Or it's reasonably predictable. And then the judge can very easily play the two experts against each other to get the information that he or she needs to make a very formed and objective decision. And the courts are very straight up about this. If you come with the information, you will win. If you don't, you may still win, actually, sadly enough, but you shouldn't win. Okay. So there's a landmark case called Northwest Hydraulics. We're actually going to look at this case in more detail in our project description portion. So they talk about a five-stage process, which is the 5 questions. Subject matter, clear objectives, technological uncertainty, hypothesis, method of systematic investigation. So that's that question 2, the 5 points that came out. The courts will ask this over and over and over and over again on every claim that comes to work. So this landmark case kind of developed that system. As we said, we want to go through this process to make that matter, right? So the scientific method says we have to do all of the following things. This is just, as we said, when you go to court and they say scientific method, the judge will then look, what's the common law definition of scientific method? Oxford, Webster, any definition you want is usually good, as long as it's reasonable. Okay, so how do we make sure that we've captured all of the information required in the scientific method? If we've missed any steps there, we don't have a clear hypothesis, we don't have conclusions, we've only got results, we're going to fall short. Okay? Again, a little bit of a grid that basically says that whether you follow the 5 steps of the court or the 3 steps proposed by CRA, you're going to be okay. The problem with the 3 steps by CRA is when they say, what's your advancement? Most people don't automatically say, well, an advancement requires me to benchmark standard practice, create objectives beyond that, identify variables of uncertainty, and then do analysis, make related conclusions. If you ask for the advancement up front, like I said, you just tipped the whole scientific method on its head and created a lot of confusion from the people who would be the most understanding are now confused because they don't understand why we've done it that way. Right? Okay. So how do we define standard practice knowledge? So again, the Northwest Hydraulics position is the CRA reviewer said that all work refers to standard devices and processes routinely used all over the world. So what happened here is in the case of Northwest Hydraulics, the engineers in question were very skilled. They were professional engineers with PhDs. I believe some of them taught at the university. And they were at a very high level. They were developing a series of diversion dams, and they had a series of problems where they had to reduce sedimentation, and they had to do achieve a series of other objectives where they said that no existing models, that they were familiar with the existing models, but no existing models could model the criteria in order to allow them to do the predictive work. Okay? And what the judge will repeatedly look at is, say, identification of variables that could not have been, and they use that word. The judges are the ones, kind of tweak me on this, that it's the variables. That the judge says, tell me what variables were not readily predictable in the existing model, what models you used, why they were not readily predictable, and what you did about it. And since the judge could see that, they basically said, well, this is a fantastic, the judge not only commented that it was an R&D project, the strongest project in Northwest Hydraulics, but he said it was indicative of an SR&ED project. It was exemplary. He could not understand how the CRA could not accept that as an SR&ED project or how it would even end up in court. So again, the courts, if you provide the evidence, will overwhelmingly rule on that. In In the United States, they've taken it a step further. And I talked to guys like Russ Roberts, who's with CATA in Ottawa, who does a lot of work on representing industry on the SR&ED program. And his view is, talking to the politicians in Ottawa, that this really applies here. This is the spirit of the way the politicians believe that the SR&ED program in Canada should be and is being applied. And what they say in the United States is if you apply for a utility patent, we'll talk about the difference between a design and utility patent, but the utility patent is how do you make something work better? Right? That's our standard patent that we're looking at, not just how something looks, which is a design patent. If you filed a utility patent, you automatically qualify. That's it, you're qualified, done. I believe you just have to file it. You don't even have to be granted, but assuming you can be granted. They also have something called a rebuttal presumption, okay? Which is really what the courts are enforcing here, but unfortunately at the CRA level they're not. That means that if you've talked about if you put a reasonable story together about why you couldn't do something, that you did do adequate benchmarking of standard practice, in order to deny your claim, the IRS technology reviewer has to show you exactly where the common knowledge would have been. Here's a report, here's a study. If you would have followed this, it would have worked right here. Okay? They can't say, they can't do what they do in Canada. I think had you looked harder, you might have found it. That's just your opinion. That's worthless in court. It only matters what you can prove. Here, I looked at these key terms, and here's what I found, and here's why it would solve your problem. Okay? That's the way they have to do it. If they can't find the solution in the United States, you win. Okay? And theoretically, that's how it should apply here, but it's not right now. Okay? So some of the quotes on why do we want to quantify objectives? Why do I really push quantify objectives as much as possible? I'm just going from what the courts have said. How do we give the courts everything that they want so that they overwhelmingly feel I have to give this claimant the credits? So one of the first cases ever, SAS Manufacturing back from the 1980s, brought this quote up that's repeated on many, many cases. So systematic investigation connotes the existence of controlled experiments, highly accurate measurements, and testing of one's theories against the empirical evidence. They go on to say, without such systematic investigation, without such measurements and analysis, systematic investigation cannot exist. In other words, it's not SR&ED. They then go on, the judge says that most technological advancement involves small, in fact, infinitesimally small incremental improvements. You don't have to be 10% better than you were before. You could be aiming to be 0.1% better than you were before, as long as it involves technological uncertainty. Okay? So you don't have to make huge changes or improvements. Infinitesimally small incremental improvements, they say, represent the majority of industrial SR&ED in Canada. All right, coordinating experiments to hypothesis. This, when you go in the stakeholders groups and development groups, we spend a lot of time arguing over this term. What's a hypothesis? Is that the right term to use? In software, should we call it something different because software developers don't understand what we mean by hypothesis, according to CRA, and certain industries have problems. So what is a hypothesis? And really, I've given my idea of how I would prove that I have a hypothesis, but it's a set of a concept that's not inconsistent with facts. So you have to gather standard practice, figure out what do I assume in order to make my hypothesis. We have what we call an informed hypothesis. And it's a tentative assumption to explain an unknown problem. Okay, my assumption is I think these 5 variables are the most important of perhaps an infinite number of variables could affect this, but I'm ranking these 5 using my professional judgment for some reason or another. And I'm going to do tests to determine if in fact those variables are as significant as I thought, and even if my rankings are in the correct order. Okay, so again, why the variables? So the judge said, I do not think conventional engineering would be adequate to deal with the variables and uncertainties inherent in the problem. So the judge looked at the evidence, said these guys did a lot of prototyping and things that were not indicative of routine engineering. Usually on routine engineering, you kind of get it the first try. You don't do 5 prototypes and revise them a lot. So again, that's evidence of experimental work. Okay. All right. scientific hypothesis. So again, I'm going now from Wikipedia. If I go to court, we're going to have to define this. The judge is going to look, what's the definition? Hypothesis. Do we have a hypothesis? Is it really a hypothesis? So for a hypothesis to be scientific, not just a general hypothesis, you have to be repeatable is the term that the courts use. You have to be able to test it. Okay? It should be based on previous observations. So again, our standard practice, it's saying to have a hypothesis, an informed hypothesis or scientific, we have to benchmark standard practice. We have to take previous observations of what would work and then we tweak it to see if that's ours. It normally follows the form of a mathematical model. 7x plus 3y times 2z, and then we've got to figure out what the x, y, and z would be. Okay? And they call it a working hypothesis. That's what we're really talking about for SR&ED. A working hypothesis is something that's plausible based on your knowledge of the current art and assumptions that you're making. Okay? And you want to do further research to see if that hypothesis is in fact correct or incorrect. How do we do this? Like I say, I recommend that you benchmark what existing variables you think are the most important, and then test whether those variables really are the most important. Okay? This takes a lot of work to get the team to agree through vote or mutiny or whatever the case may be, what are the top 3 to 5 variables. And that's, if you get the discussion focusing on that, that's usually a good thing. So whether you get total agreement on the ranking of the variables or whichever ones are in there, as long as you have several variables that are significant, you're going to be able to allocate a lot of the work to the resolution of those problems. Okay? Systematic investigation. So they say they want repeatable experiments where the results are carefully noted. Again, you're not going to be able to get around that. The ones where they don't keep any evidence are typically going to lose unless you have very credible witnesses, in which case even that's going to pass, apparently. Okay. Rainbow pipeline systematic investigation. They say the difference between a routine activity and an SR&ED activity is not just that they keep detailed notes, but follow the entire scientific method. Okay? So again, I would say if you want to take all these comments, you can throw everything that they say away and say, if you understand the scientific method, if you really understand it, that's all you need to know in order to complete an SR&ED project. And that's the position. I mean, I've given you a lot of background about why I say that, but ultimately at the end of the day, that's the easiest way to follow it. Okay, so they say rejection of a hypothesis can represent a technological advance. It's your failures that are often the most evidence of the technological advancement. Okay? It reinforces a measure of technological uncertainty as long as you make the conclusion. And the difference between a business failure and a technological advancement is one just stops at the results. We didn't achieve it, we're going to give up, and we don't know why it didn't work. Okay? Versus a technological conclusion, we didn't achieve it, we're going to give up. We may not still know why it didn't work, but we hypothesize it could be related to these variables. That's still a technological advancement. Okay? You're getting a step closer to the final answer.
Do you need a record of this hypothesis as to show the SR&ED?
Pardon me?
Do you need a record of the hypothesis?
They record hypothesis?
Yeah.
I would recommend that. And that's where I'm going, that is the CRA, when they do the reviews, so we'll work backwards from their CRA review policy, will generally ask you questions like, when did you first phrase your hypothesis? This is the question that they'll ask you in a letter. It's like a standard form letter. So people don't know what they mean. What that really means is, what date can you show evidence that you identified more than one variable, I'd say 3 or more variables, that you don't know how they're going to work together in your situation, and the due diligence that you provided didn't provide a model that will reasonably lead you to go directly to the answer. Okay? Everything from that point onwards is SR&ED. Okay? And they'll ask you for evidence, like, how do I know it was February 8th, like you say? Well, I sent an email to this engineer asking him, hey, I think I got a problem here, what do you think about this? And they emailed back saying, that's a very good problem. Okay, then they'll say, great. Every cost after February 8th that you dealt with that problem is in. Everything that you did before February 8th to deal with that issue is part of your due diligence. It's part of the business project. It's not part of the SR&ED project. Okay? So this becomes very interesting. The prior art searches, what I'll tell someone is, maybe you looked at 400 patents. Okay? So is any of that in or is it out? I'd say it depends. I'd say if after the 5th patent you said, look, I I know I got problems on this. I'm going to look at 395 more to see how other guys have dealt with that and get a better idea. That would be applied research. Okay? It's the point where you, as the developer, can phrase the hypothesis. The courts have said it's a self-assessing system. You're the scientist. The point you can prove that you had a hypothesis that you believe is a technological advancement, that's when they're going to consider it to start, right? And it's going to be based on your evidence, not what you think, or CRA reviewers. All got to be backed by evidence.
I started with the hypothesis, I tested, failed, so I think, okay, I should proceed in this direction, but do I need to write everything down? Okay, I'm thinking this, and then I can do this one.
Well, you know what? Let me revisit that question when I'll show you how I recommend that you document that. We're going to do that in the next section. And then we'll come back and say, why would we do it that way? Okay? Okay. Any other questions on that? How the tax courts work versus CRA? How they're not really on the same side? The tax courts are the watchdog for the Canada Revenue Agency. And there's probably, as far as I understand, 580 to 600 claims in Ontario right now that are at the objection stage, many of which are going to end up in court. So we're going to see tens, if not dozens, of tax court cases probably coming through in the next year or two. I know this because I'm helping advise some of the other consultants who are taking these to court. So I know that many consultants might have 5 or 10 objections that they feel should be going to court, and they're all in the lineup right now.